Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The war was finally over, but Captain Ethan Vale still felt like he was caught in the middle of a battle he couldn't escape. His ship glided smoothly through the atmosphere of Astralis V, the home planet he hadn't set foot on in years, but his mind was thousands of light years away, trapped in the fiery skies of battle zones and the cold, indifferent void of space. His hands gripped the control panel, knuckles white, even though the landing was routine, as simple as breathing. Routine. It was a word he hadn't used for a long time. He no longer knew what normal felt like. Even now, as the lush green landscape of his homeland stretched beneath him, there was a sense of displacement in his chest, like he was a stranger to this place, to himself. The landing thrusters engaged with a soft hum, and the ship settled onto the pad. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a long breath. The engines powered down, the quiet hum fading into silence, but the noise in his head was louder than ever. The docking bay doors slid open, and there she was, Selena, standing at the edge of the pad, waiting for him. Her eyes were searching, hopeful, but guarded. She didn't run to him, didn't shout his name or wave excitedly like she used to before the war. There was no grand reunion, only the weight of years and the space between them. He stepped off the ship, his body stiff from too many hours in the cockpit. Each step toward her felt like he was walking on foreign ground. When he finally reached her, they stood there for a moment in silence. "Welcome home," Lena said, her voice soft but distant, like the words themselves were hard to reach. Ethan nodded. "It's good to be back." They didn't embrace. Instead, Lena turned toward the sleek transport vehicle waiting for them, and Ethan followed her without a word. The ride back to their home was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the engine and the occasional beep of traffic signals. Lena's fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel, a nervous habit she had developed over the years. It was a small thing, but it stood out to Ethan now, like every detail of this world was unfamiliar, like he had forgotten how to be part of it. When they arrived, Myra wasn't there. His daughter was still at school, finishing her final exams before summer break. He had missed most of her childhood, only seeing glimpses of her through the occasional video transmission, the war always pulling him back before he could fully reconnect. Now she was nearly grown, a stranger to him. Inside the house, nothing had changed, at least on the surface. The furniture was the same, the walls still adorned with the same photos and artwork, but there was an unspoken tension in the air, a barrier that kept Ethan at a distance. He sat down at the kitchen table, watching as Lena moved about, making tea, her movements quick and deliberate. "I heard about something," she said after a long stretch of silence. "It might help." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Help with what?" "With everything." Lena set the steaming mug of tea in front of him and sat down across the table. Her eyes searched his, as if she was looking for the man she once knew. "There's a new program, a technology they've developed since the war ended. It's called the Mind Sphere. It's supposed to help veterans with what you're going through." "What am I going through?" Ethan's voice was flat, but there was an edge to it. Lena didn't flinch. "You're not the same, Ethan. You haven't been since the day you left for that first deployment. The war changed you. It changed all of us, but you've been through things I can't even imagine." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The Mind Sphere is designed to help people process trauma, anxiety, fear. It's not like therapy. It's immersive." Ethan stared into the swirling tea. He knew she was right. He hadn't been the same since the war. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the restless nights. He was a soldier who had returned from battle, but the battle hadn't left him. Still, the idea of diving into his own mind, of confronting the things he'd buried deep down, made him uneasy. "How does it work?" he asked, his voice gruff. Lena relaxed a little, sensing that he was at least considering it. "You enter a simulation, but it's not like any other kind of simulation you've experienced. It's a fully immersive mental environment, tailored to your subconscious. It forces you to confront your fears, Your guilt, your memories. They say it's incredibly effective for people with combat trauma. Ethan's first instinct was to refuse. He had survived the war by keeping everything locked away, by pushing forward without looking back. But something in Lena's eyes, the hope, the desperation made him pause. He owed it to her, to Myra, to at least try. "All right," he said finally. "I'll try it." The next day, Ethan found himself standing in front of a sleek, glass-walled facility on the outskirts of the city. The sign above the entrance read, "Mindsphere Center for Veteran Wellness." Inside, the atmosphere was sterile, clinical, but not cold. The receptionist smiled warmly as she checked him in, and moments later, a technician appeared to guide him to one of the treatment rooms. The device itself was simply just a sleek, curved chair that reclined slightly, with a soft, cushioned helmet suspended above. Ethan sat down, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. The technician explained the process in a calm, soothing voice, but Ethan barely heard her. His heart was pounding in his chest. "Ready?" the technician asked. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was. The helmet lowered over his head, and for a moment, everything went dark. Then, slowly, light bloomed all around him, soft and warm, like the glow of a distant sun. He wasn't in the sterile room anymore. He was standing on a beach, the waves lapping gently at the shore, the sky painted in hues of pink and gold. The air smelled of salt and sand, and a soft breeze rustled his hair. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. A voice spoke in his ear, soft but clear. "Welcome to the Mind Sphere, Ethan. I'm Aurora, your guide. I'll be with you throughout your sessions." Ethan turned, but there was no one there. Just the endless expanse of beach and the soft murmur of the waves. He wasn't sure what he had expected, a hologram, perhaps so, but the voice was disembodied, floating in the air around him. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice sounding strange in the quiet. "This is your introductory session," Aurora replied. "The environment is designed to be calming, to help ease you into the process. You're safe here." Safe. It was a word that felt foreign to him. He hadn't felt truly safe in years. "What do I do?" he asked, feeling a little foolish. "For now, just breathe. Walk. Explore. We'll take things slowly at first." Ethan hesitated, then began to walk along the shore. The sand felt real beneath his feet, the wind cool against his skin. For a moment, it was almost easy to forget that none of this was real. He could almost let himself relax. But then, without warning, the sky began to darken. The warm hues of sunset faded to a deep, bruised purple, and the soft breeze turned cold and biting. The waves crashed harder against the shore, the sound of the water rising to a roar. "What's happening?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. "This is your mind, Ethan." Aurora's voice was calm, though there was an undercurrent of something else. "You're beginning to confront the things you've been holding on to. Don't fight it. Let it come." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the beach around him began to dissolve. The sand beneath his feet shifted, turning to ash. The horizon disappeared into a void, and suddenly he wasn't on a beach anymore. He was in the cockpit of his fighter, the hum of the engines vibrating through his bones, the controls slick beneath his hands. The sky outside the cockpit was filled with fire. Explosions bloomed like flowers in the distance, and ships screamed past, their engines roaring as they dodged enemy fire. Ethan's breath came in short, shallow gasps, his body tense, ready for combat. But this wasn't real. He wasn't there. This was the mind sphere. He had to remind himself of that. But it didn't stop the fear from clawing at his chest, the panic rising as the ship shuddered beneath him. A voice crackled through the comms. "Vale, we need to retreat. We're outnumbered." Ethan knew what came next. He had lived it over and over again in his nightmares. Ethan gripped the controls, his mind racing. He knew this moment. He had lived through it in reality, and he had replayed it countless times in his nightmares. His squadron was outnumbered, overwhelmed. There was only one option: to retreat, regroup, and hope to survive. But that decision had come at a price. "Commander, we have to fall back." The voice over the comms shouted again, desperate, pleading. Ethan's stomach clenched. His mind screamed at him to issue the order to hold the line, to fight, but he knew better. If they stayed, they would be slaughtered. He hesitated for a heartbeat too long. Another explosion rocked the ship beside him, a Reed ship. The flames engulfed it, the hull splitting open like a ripe fruit. Ethan heard Reed's voice, a final scream, cut off by static. And then, silence. The rest of the battle was a blur. He had given the retreat order, and those who could, fled. But Reed didn't make it. Ethan had always blamed himself, convinced that if he hadn't hesitated, if he had acted faster, Reed would still be alive. And now, in the mind sphere, that moment played out again with horrifying clarity. "Why didn't you save me, Ethan?" The voice came from behind him, cold and accusing. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to turn around, didn't want to face what he knew was waiting for him, but he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he swiveled in his pilot's seat, his heart hammering in his chest. Reed stood there, his uniform charred and torn, his face twisted in pain and betrayal. His eyes were dark, lifeless, and yet they bore into Ethan, cutting him deeper than any wound ever could. "You could have saved me," Reed said again, his voice hollow. "Why didn't you?" Ethan's hands tightened around the controls until his knuckles turned white. "I couldn't." "Yeah, you hesitated," Reed interrupted, his voice a sharp blade. "You had a chance, and you froze." "I'm dead because of you." "I made the only call I could," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "If I hadn't ordered the retreat, we all would have died." "But you didn't give me a chance." Reed's figure loomed closer, stepping through the cockpit. His charred hands reached out, gripping the edge of Ethan's seat. "You gave up on me." Ethan wanted to scream, wanted to rip the helmet off and pull himself out of this nightmare, but he couldn't. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of his guilt. He had buried it for so long, telling himself he had done the right thing, that it was the only way. But here, in the mind sphere, there were no lies, no justifications, just the truth. "You have to confront this," Rory's voice whispered in his ear, soft but firm. "You can't move forward until you let go." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry, his pulse thundering in his ears. "I didn't want to leave you behind, Reed. But I didn't have a choice. We were outnumbered. If we hadn't retreated, everyone would have been lost." Reed's face twisted in anger. "So you ran. You abandoned me." "I had to," Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. "I had to make a call. It wasn't just about you, it was about all of us. I couldn't save everyone." "But you could have saved me," Reed's voice echoed in his mind, growing fainter, as if the figure before him was starting to dissolve, the edges of his form blurring. Ethan felt the tears burning in his eyes, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible over the roar of his heart. "I'm so damn sorry." Reed's face softened, the anger fading, replaced by something that looked almost like understanding. For a brief moment, his figure flickered, and Ethan swore he saw a small, sad smile. "I know," Reed said, his voice gentler now. "I know." And just like that, Reed was gone. The cockpit dissolved around him, fading into nothingness, until Ethan was left standing in a vast, empty space, the cold stillness wrapping around him like a blanket. His heart ached, but there was a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted from his chest. He stood there for a long moment, his breath coming in slow, deep waves, the adrenaline finally ebbing away. He had faced it. The guilt, the blame. He had finally admitted to himself what he had been avoiding for years. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo what had happened, but he could forgive himself. "You're doing well, Ethan," Rory's voice cut through the quiet. "But there's more to confront." "Are you ready?" Ethan closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm ready." The next session was harder, though in a different way. It wasn't about the battlefield this time. It was about home. Ethan found himself in his old house, the one he had shared with Lena and Myra before the war. The sun was setting outside, casting the living room in a warm, golden light. The furniture was the same, the smell of freshly cooked food lingered in the air, and for a moment, it almost felt like he was stepping back in time, into a simpler life. But there was a tension here too. He could feel it in the air, a subtle shift, an undercurrent of something unresolved. Myra, as a child, ran through the living room, laughing, her arms outstretched like she was flying. Lena was in the kitchen, humming to herself, her back turned to him. It was a scene he had seen 100 times before, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to someone else. Ethan took a step forward, watching the scene unfold. This wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't filled with explosions or death. But it was still a fight for the life he had left behind, for the family he had pushed away without even realizing it. Lena turned around, smiling softly as she wiped her hands on a towel. "Dinner's almost ready," she said, her voice light and easy. "Why don't you go wash up?" Ethan blinked, confused for a moment. This was a memory, a day long gone, but still so vivid. He felt a lump rise in his throat, a deep ache spreading through his chest. He hadn't appreciated these moments when they were happening. He hadn't realized how much he would miss them. As he stood there, frozen in place, the scene began to shift. The warm glow of the sun faded, the laughter turned hollow, and suddenly the house was empty. Lena and Myra were gone, and Ethan was alone, standing in the middle of a dark, silent room. He swallowed hard, feeling the coldness creeping in. This was what he feared the most, not the battles, not the war, but this. The silence. The distance between him and the people he loved. Aurore's voice broke through the quiet. "You didn't just leave the battlefield, Ethan. You left them too." Ethan closed his eyes, his fists clenching at his sides. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know how to stay connected when I was out there. Every day was about survival. It was all I could focus on. But now you're home," Aurora said gently, "and they're still waiting for you." The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. He had come back from the war, but in many ways, he hadn't really returned. He had left pieces of himself out there, and those pieces had built walls around him, walls that kept Lena and Myra at a distance. He opened his eyes, staring at the empty room. It felt like a reflection of his own heart, a cold, distant, disconnected. He didn't want it to be that way anymore. "I want to fix it," he whispered. "I don't want to be this man anymore." The room began to change, slowly at first, then more rapidly. Light seeped in through the windows, the warmth returning. The sound of Myra's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, and the scent of Lena's cooking filled the air once again. "You can," Aurora said softly. "It's not too late." Ethan took a deep breath, the weight on his chest easing a little. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be hard conversations, painful truths to face, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was ready to confront it all. The session ended, the mind's fear pulling him back into the real world. As the helmet lifted from his head, Ethan blinked against the bright light of the room, his body heavy but his mind clearer than it had been in years. Lena was waiting for him outside, her hands folded in her lap, her face soft with concern. When she saw him, she stood up, her eyes searching his for any sign of change. Ethan walked toward her, feeling something new, something fragile but real, a hope. He reached out, taking her hand gently, and for the first time in years, he felt present. "I'm here," he said softly, meeting her gaze. "I'm really here." And this time, it wasn't a lie.